An intriguing aspect of the Jack the Ripper case is the number of people who would later claim inside knowledge about the murders and the murderer. Several of the officers who worked on the investigation, for example, Robert Anderson and Donald Swanson being two that spring immediately to mind, would go on record to claim that the police had actually ascertained the perpetrator's identity. Other people would contact journalists, often many years later, to say that a friend or a relative of theirs had been the person who carried out history's most infamous crime spree, although why people would be eager to claim that a member of their family had been Jack the Ripper has always baffled me. However, many more people would later insist that they, or someone they were related to or knew, had actually encountered the Ripper and had lived to tell the tale. The big problem for us today is that since none of the direct evidence on the case has survived, it really is impossible for us to judge the veracity of these claims, and it ultimately boils down to how trustworthy we consider each claimant to be. What is also of interest is some of the measures that were adopted to bring the Whitechapel murderer to justice. We know, for example, that several journalists, sundry men, and at least one police officer disguised themselves as women in order to attempt to apprehend the person responsible for the crimes. We also know that detectives and plainclothes men were sent into the streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields in all manner of disguises to hunt for Jack the Ripper. How successful they were, well, let's just say the murderer, as far as is known, was never actually caught. Indeed, the big joke in the area at the time was that no matter what disguise these undercover detectives wore, they always kept their standard issue police boots on, and those, along with their regimented style of walking, made them easy to spot. There have also been suggestions, although it was never officially confirmed, that decoys were used to try and tempt the killer into striking. The Eastern Evening News, in its edition of Saturday the 15th of September 1888, carried a brief article under the headline, "Male Decoys for the Assassin." The subsequent article included the assertion that it is quite certain that for 2 nights past, 3 medical students have been out armed with revolver and dagger concealed in the dresses worn by them. What the article didn't make clear, though, was whether the 3 students were acting with the consent and encouragement of the police, or whether they undertook their nocturnal endeavours on their own initiatives. But suppose you did want to disguise yourself in order to capture the Whitechapel murderer. Where would you go to acquire a realistic outfit? On one of the buildings on Wardour Street in London's bustling West End, there is a handsome clock on which are emblazoned the words costumier and perruquier, the latter, by the way, simply meaning a person who creates, styles or sells perruques or hairpieces. A blue plaque on the wall beneath the clock reveals that this building was once the premises of Willie Clarkson, theatrical wig maker. In his 1934 biography of Clarkson, The Strange Life of Willie Clarkson, his friend Harry Greenwall revealed that during the Ripper murders, Clarkson disguised a number of detectives and medical students to act as decoys in Whitechapel. As the review of the book that appeared in The Bystander on Wednesday the 15th of January 1936 put it, it must have been poorish fun acting as a decoy for the Ripper. In 1888, there were even suggestions that the local prostitutes be enrolled as decoys and, shadowed by detectives, be sent out onto the streets in the hope that they might attract the attention of the murderer, thus enabling the shadowing officers to pounce and apprehend him. However, if Mrs. Amelia Brown is to be believed, local girls, or at least one local girl, were used as decoys by the police. Amelia Brown's story was covered by quite a few newspapers in February 1949. The South London Observer featured a brief snippet about her in its edition of Friday the 11th of February. Decoy for the Ripper. Most women would scream and barricade themselves up indoors if they thought they were likely to be chased by someone like Jack the Ripper. Not so Mrs. Amelia Brown, who will soon be 82 and who at 17 went out as a decoy for Jack the Ripper. Still a resolute old lady, as she must have been a resolute young one, Mrs. Brown said, "I just walked about with a couple of techs watching me." Fortunately, the Leicester Chronicle, in its edition of Saturday the 19th of February, expanded on the story a little more. Brave woman. Living in a one-room Peckham flatlet is a white-haired little woman who will be 82 soon. Just over 60 years ago, she volunteered to act as a decoy for a murderer who had terrorized all London, the dreaded Jack the Ripper. The name of this heroine is Mrs. Amelia Brown. In those days, Amelia was an attractive young brunette, the daughter of a Stepney licensee. Her best friends included the detectives of Arbor Square Police Station, centre of the Ripper hunt, and one night Amelia offered to go out at midnight and allow the police to shadow her in the hope that the Ripper would strike. He did. As Amelia walked around the block where the London hospital then stood, a rope was dropped over her shoulders. She blew her whistle for all she was worth, and her shadows, Detectives Gill and Payne, came racing up. Though a thorough search of the neighbourhood was made, no sign of her attacker was found. Several of the articles that covered her story quoted Amelia as stating, "I still think Jack the Ripper was a doctor, and he was after me that night." Of course, whether Amelia Brown had in fact been used as a decoy at the height of the Ripper scare is impossible to ascertain now. From the various newspaper accounts, it is apparent that decoys were used, but whether the police were desperate enough for a breakthrough in the case that they were willing to encourage a teenage girl to put her life at risk, well, I shall leave it to viewers to decide. Let me know in the comments below what you think.